In the frozen wastelands of the Eastern Front, men fought not just against each other, but against the cold, hunger, and the limits of human endurance. And in their hands was a weapon as unforgiving as the land itself, the Mosin-Nagant rifle. Crude, heavy, relentless. For millions of Soviet soldiers, it was their only lifeline and their silent executioner. This is not a story about a legendary rifle. It's a story about survival when your weapon is as old, worn, and cold as you are. It's January 1943. Stalingrad. The temperature, -25 degrees Celsius. Private Mikhail Sidorov crouches in a half-collapsed building. His Mosin-Nagant rests across his knees, its barrel frosted with ice. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. His fingers are too numb to feel the trigger. When he tries to chamber a round, the bolt jams. He slams it with his palm. Nothing. He hits it harder. The metal tears skin from his fingers. In the silence between explosions, Mikhail whispers a prayer, not to survive the Germans, but to make his rifle fire one more time. Across the Eastern Front, scenes like this repeated themselves 1,000 times over. The Mosin-Nagant was the backbone of a Red Army, issued to more than 17 million soldiers. It was old, outdated, and primitive compared to German Mausers or American Garans. But in Stalin's war, there were no other options. The Mosin was more than a weapon, it was a test of willpower. In the hands of a desperate man, it could be deadly. But in the wrong conditions, it was a curse. The Eastern Front was the deadliest theater of World War II. From 1941 to 1945, over 27 million Soviets died. The rifle they carried through it all, the same one designed before their grandfathers were born. To understand what that means, we need to go back to the rifle's beginning and to the empire that built it. The Mosin-Nagant was born in the ashes of humiliation. The year was 1891. The Russian Empire had just endured a series of defeats and military embarrassments. The army's rifles were outdated, slow to reload, and unreliable. In an age when France, Germany, and Britain were modernizing their weapons, Russia was falling behind. So the Tsar's military commission set out to find a new rifle, one that could match Europe's best. 2 designs stood out, one by a Russian captain, Sergei Mosin, and another by a Belgian designer, Mosin-Nagant. After months of debate and political infighting, the army combined both designs into a single hybrid rifle, the Mosin-Nagant Model 1891. It was a rugged 5-round bolt-action rifle chambered in 7.62 x 54 mmR, a cartridge still used by Russian machine guns today. It fired with tremendous power, capable of penetrating German helmets and winter coats alike. But even in its early years, soldiers complained. The bolt was stiff, the trigger unpredictable. The cleaning process was a nightmare. One officer during the Russo-Japanese War wrote, "The Mosin is loyal, like a stubborn mule, but it will make you suffer for its loyalty." Fast forward to June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Germany invades the Soviet Union with over 3 million men. When the Wehrmacht stormed across the border, the Soviet arsenal was a chaotic mix of old Mosins, newer semi-automatics, and whatever else they could find. Factories in Tula, Izhevsk, and Sestroretsk raced to produce rifles faster than they could train soldiers to use them. By the time the war reached its bloodiest months, the Mosin-Nagant had become the Red Army's lifeline. There were dozens of variations, infantry models, cavalry carbines, and sniper versions with PU scopes. The most famous of all, the M91/30, the standard-issue rifle of the Soviet soldier. In skilled hands, it could be deadly accurate. Soviet snipers like Zaitsev and Pavlichenko turned the rifle into a legend, using it to eliminate hundreds of German soldiers from the ruins of cities. But for every sniper's rifle tuned to perfection, there were thousands more that jammed, froze, or misfired in the field. The Eastern Front was the ultimate test. Mud, ice, blood, and gunpowder mixed into an unholy soup. When temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, the rifle's lubricants froze solid. Soldiers learned to strip them clean, sometimes using their own urine to thaw the bolt. When the snow melted, the mud clogged the barrel. When the Germans advanced, replacements were rushed from half-built factories, stamped together with poor metal and warped wood. A Soviet conscript could receive a Mosin with a cracked stock, a worn-out barrel, and a bolt that barely turned. But orders were clear. Every rifle must fight. In the industrial cities deep behind the front lines, women and teenagers worked 16-hour shifts assembling rifles. No polish, no precision, just speed. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviets produced over 12 million Mosin-Nagants. They didn't aim for perfection, just quantity. A rifle wasn't a tool of excellence anymore. It was a tool of endurance. Yet despite all its flaws, the Mosin had one thing going for it: simplicity. Few moving parts. Easy to fix if you had the time. And it could still deliver a killing blow at nearly 800 meters. It was brutal, slow, and crude, but it worked. At least, when everything went right. And in war, things rarely did. Imagine a Soviet soldier at Kursk, July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Artillery shakes the earth. Dust fills the air. He raises his Mosin, aims at a German infantryman, and pulls the trigger. Click. The bolt won't move. He slams it open, forcing the metal back. The casing ejects, warped from heat. He loads another round. Fires. Smoke and sparks jump from the muzzle. The recoil slams into his shoulder, bruising bone. And he fires again. And again. Because the rifle doesn't care how much it hurts you, only that it kills the enemy first. The Mosin-Nagant became the face of Soviet resilience and desperation. For snipers, it was precision incarnate. For frontline infantry, it was a burden that demanded respect or punishment. In the trenches and ruins of cities, its bayonet turned it into a spear. In the hands of starving peasants drafted into war, it became both lifeline and curse. Every scratch, dent, and frozen bolt told the story of survival. Not glory, not heroism, just survival. But beneath that legacy lies the truth few documentaries tell: the brutal, mechanical flaws that cost countless lives. The weapon that symbolized Soviet grit also exposed the Soviet Union's deepest weaknesses. And what came next was far from glorious. On paper, the Mosin-Nagant was reliable, simple, effective. But on the battlefield, those words meant very little. For Soviet infantrymen, the rifle's flaws weren't just technical, they were lethal. Let's break it down. The Mosin's bolt-action system was crude, built in an era before precision engineering. Under clean conditions, it worked fine. But on the Eastern Front, nothing was ever clean. Mud froze into ice. Sand ground against the metal. And the bolt, that vital mechanism that chambered each round, would jam solid. Veterans recalled smashing their rifle bolts with rocks, boots, even rifle butts, anything to make them move. One Red Army private wrote, "When your rifle froze, you didn't panic. You swore you hit it, and you prayed the German on the other side was having the same problem." The Mauser 98K, used by the Germans, had smoother machining, a more refined bolt, and better tolerances. The Mosin was rough, stiff, and sometimes outright dangerous. If a soldier forced the bolt too hard, it could shear the extractor or bend the firing pin, effectively turning the rifle into dead weight. And dead weight was something no soldier could afford. Even the cartridges were unreliable. Each Mosin-Nagant fired 7.62 x 54 mmR rounds, powerful, but rimmed, meaning the edge of each cartridge overlapped the one below it in the magazine. If loaded incorrectly, the rounds jammed inside the magazine well, locking the rifle mid-battle. Soldiers had to learn the Mosin shuffle, tapping the base of the magazine, shaking the weapon, or reloading under fire to free a jam. Every wasted second could cost a life. Worse yet, ammunition quality varied wildly. Factories scattered across the Soviet Union, some in makeshift warehouses, produced rounds that weren't always to spec. Powder loads were inconsistent. Casings were rough. Primers misfired. A rifleman never really knew if his next shot would fire or fail. The Mosin wasn't light. At over 9 pounds per kilograms, it was one of the heaviest standard rifles of World War II. Add a bayonet, and it became even more cumbersome. Soviet soldiers often carried it across miles of mud and snow, through ruined villages and forests. By the time combat began, they were already exhausted. And then came the recoil. The 7.62 x 54 mmR was a beast of cartridge, delivering bone-rattling power. Each shot slammed into the shooter's shoulder with a deep, punishing kick. With no rubber pad, just steel against wood, soldiers frequently bruised or dislocated their shoulders after long firefights. One sniper joked, "The Mosin teaches you to hate your own body before you hate the enemy." Despite its reputation among snipers, the standard-issue Mosin was far from precise. The open sights were crude and easily misaligned. Many rifles came from factories with poorly machined barrels or warped stocks, causing rounds to drift inches, even feet, off target. In the chaos of battle, aiming for a clean shot was a fantasy. Soviet doctrine emphasized volume over accuracy. Fire. Advance. Fire again. The Mosin wasn't a precision weapon, it was a survival tool. a wooden club that happened to shoot bullets. As the war dragged on, production standards plummeted. In 1942, when German forces were closing in on Soviet industrial centers, entire factories were dismantled and relocated east to Siberia, the Urals, and Kazakhstan. When they reassembled the production lines, the new rifles were rougher, less consistent, and often rushed out with defects. Barrels weren't properly rifled, with stock split in the cold. Metal parts rusted before they even reached the front. A Soviet armorer from Izhevsk described it plainly. "We didn't build rifles. We built desperation." Perhaps the strangest and deadliest feature of the Mosin-Nagant was its bayonet. It was long, triangular, and permanently attached during combat. Soviet doctrine demanded it stay fixed at all times. Why? Because removing it changed the rifle's point of impact. The bullet would hit several inches off target without it. So soldiers marched, crawled, and fought with a meter-long spear of steel sticking from the muzzle. In urban combat, it was more liability than weapon. It caught on rubble, doorways, and trenches. But orders were orders. The Red Army didn't fight with comfort. It fought with endurance. Despite all of this, Soviet soldiers adapted. They learned to work with the rifle, not against it. They cleaned it dry to prevent freezing. They carried bolts wrapped in rags. They prayed to never drop it in mud. Because losing a Mosin didn't just mean losing your weapon. It meant facing the fury of Soviet military discipline. During the worst months of the war, soldiers caught retreating or without rifles could be executed on the spot by NKVD officers. The rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was your identity, your proof of loyalty. The Mosin-Nagant became a symbol of the Soviet war machine, relentless, outdated, but terrifyingly determined. And while the Germans had engineering, the Soviets had endurance. Every Mosin that fired in the bitter cold, every jammed bolt forced open with bloody hands, became part of a collective story, one written in pain and survival. When the war ended in 1945, over 12 million Mosin-Nagants had been produced. They were stacked in warehouses, shipped to allies, and stored in bunkers across the Soviet Union. But peace didn't make the rifle obsolete, not yet. In the years after World War II, the Mosin-Nagant became the Soviet Union's greatest export. Thousands were sent to communist allies, China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. The Chinese copied it as the Type 53, the Finns modified it for their own defense, and even the North Vietnamese used it against American troops decades later. Wherever Soviet influence spread, the Mosin followed. It became the poor man's rifle of revolution, seen in the hands of guerrillas, militias, and freedom fighters across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The rifle outlived Stalin himself. But back home, the Mosin was replaced. By the 1950s, the SKS and AK-47 were taking over. Semi-automatic firepower and modern design made the old bolt-action relic redundant. Still, the Mosin never truly disappeared. Its simplicity meant it could sit for decades in storage and still fire when called upon. In the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed, hundreds of thousands were sold off to civilians and collectors. Even today, in parts of Eastern Europe, hunters use the same rifle their grandfathers carried to war. For the men who survived the Eastern Front, the Mosin-Nagant remained both a weapon and a wound. Some remembered it fondly, as the tool that kept them alive. Others hated it, as a reminder of comrades who froze to death clutching its wooden stock. A veteran from Leningrad once said, "We didn't love the Mosin. We respected it, because it killed when we needed it to, and when it didn't, it made us stronger." That's the strange duality of the rifle, hated and loved, cursed and revered. It symbolized the very soul of the Soviet war effort, outdated, brutal, unyielding, but unstoppable. Ironically, the lessons learned from the Mosin's flaws shaped the next generation of Soviet weapons. Kalashnikov, who designed the AK-47, once noted that reliability and ease of maintenance were the foundations of Soviet small arms, born from the suffering of World War II. The Mosin taught them that in war, complexity kills. Simplicity saves lives. Every jammed bolt, every misfire, every soldier who froze in the snow, all fed into that one truth. The AK-47 would go on to become the most recognizable weapon on Earth, and in its rugged soul, you can still feel the ghost of the Mosin-Nagant. The Mosin-Nagant wasn't the best rifle of World War II. It wasn't even close. But it was the rifle that fought the longest, in the harshest war, under the worst conditions, and somehow endured. It was crude, painful, and merciless, like the war itself. And maybe that's why it worked. Because in the Soviet Union's greatest struggle, there was no room for perfection. Only survival.